In my last video on phrasing, I introduced the concept of musical phrasing, and I also mentioned that in jazz, sometimes phrasing is something that musicians will experiment with, especially when the musician in question is a virtuoso who has great command over their musical abilities. And I'm going to argue that this kind of experimentation has actually led to a bit of a fetishization of experimental phrasing, phrasing that ends up veering off from the audience's expectations of phrasing. Phrasing can sometimes have an intuitive feeling to it. There are certain phrases which we hear which we feel like must be completed with a certain kind of rhythm. A famous one that is culturally well known is shave in a haircut, which is demonstrated as shave in a haircut, 2 bits. So there's always that rhythm at the end of it. As examples of pop music that makes great use of intuitive phrasing, consider something like Prince's song, Kiss, or even Joy Division's Love Will Tear Us Apart. Each one uses a fairly repetitive, regular, rhythmic phrasing, with just enough twists and turns to keep the listener interested. Compare this to any number of recent experimental pop acts, who often are also labeled as ambient or art pop. They often pay little to no attention to any kind of regularity or rhythmic repetition in their phrasing. Their songcraft, for better or for worse, is often described as stream of consciousness, and it shows. As a side point, the question about how this phrasing exactly comes to be intuitive can be a little bit controversial. Some people might claim that it's a natural thing that's ingrained in us. Other people might claim that it's something that's more culturally formed over time through a series of various cultural factors coming together and normalizing a particular type of phrasing or artistic flourish. I think this debate is not so relevant here. I'm more inclined to side with the cultural constructivist point myself, but I don't think this is really going to be a problem for my argument, because it's more about the idea of whether or not this kind of intuitive phrasing is something that's desirable. One thing we might be able to agree upon here, whether we think it's a natural or cultural kind of construction, is that we can usually agree that non-standardized systems are harder to keep track of and harder to have people come together and share a sense of connection under. Moving on, some of the most odious abuses of this kind of phrasing experimentation can be found in soloists, both in instrumental and vocal forms, the kinds who show off rather than play with any meaningful interaction as part of a group. But the tendency is also present in what we might call art pop, in which there's often an impulse towards writing lyrics that don't really conform to any particular standard rhythm. My question is, why? It's my personal feeling that these experimental impulses are actually leading us to a glut of incredibly forgettable music. Don't get me wrong, it might sound impressive in the moment, and there might be other musically interesting aspects of it, but it does seem to have a much lower hit-to-miss ratio in terms of what's memorable and what's not. I would blame this largely on phrasing. If your phrasing's not memorable, it's going to be a lot harder for a larger number of people to remember the song. Now, I do believe that some songwriters can get away with lyrics that are memorable enough that the phrasing doesn't really matter so much. A good example of this is someone like John Darnielle from the Mountain Goats. But even in his songs, he often falls back on catchy phrasings once in a while, in his most memorable ones anyway. The reason this art pop experimentation is so baffling to me is that, well, pop music is meant to be memorable. If you're arguing against that, you're some kind of contrarian. And I would also argue that pop music is the direct successor to another popular art form that relied for much of its lifespan on incredibly formulaic phrasing. This art form is poetry. From its origins in the epic poems of ancient cultures, poetry's relied a lot on regular rhythms to get people to remember it. Sonnets, villanelles, haikus, etc. They all have certain established formulas for phrasing. The phonoaesthetic term for the kind of phrasing that people remember is often known as euphony. Words sound good together in an intuitive kind of way. Poetry was often something of a popular art form. It was something that could bring people together because they could all share in a single cultural experience. I would argue that pop music is actually a natural heir to this. Keep in mind that pop music phrasing doesn't always adhere to the same kinds of extremely rigid structures as poetry. There are some prefabricated pop songwriting structures like the blues, but pop lyrics don't always have to fit a pre-existing template.
They just have to have some kind of internally consistent structure that listeners can pick up on easily.
As poetry became increasingly less accessible with the rise of modernism in the 20th century, it started to fall out of the public eye a bit. This is why I would argue that pop music sort of picks up where poetry leaves off. Now, you can argue that these modernist experiments produce some truly great and interesting poetic art. I actually agree with that. But I'd also like to point out that the art that resulted was very dense and difficult to engage with for the average person. Even today, more of it's studied in academic and intellectual contexts than in any kind of popular discourse. Arguments about the artistic merit of these experiments aside, it seems fairly clear that with the rise of pop music in the mid-20th century, pop music was just picking up where popular poetry left off. Now, I'm not arguing that musicians should always play to popular tastes, or that there isn't any room for experimentation in popular songwriting or pop song phrasing. It just feels a little bit odd to me that such a large number of musicians at the moment are reaching for this kind of experimental phrasing that's unlikely to have much of an impact. Is this out of carelessness? Lack of awareness? A genuine worship of avant-garde and ugly aesthetics brought on by the punk revolution? Maybe this whole perspective is going a bit too far. Maybe experimental phrasing is the future of pop music.